Remember when I theorized that Fear Street Part 1 may very well be a one-off gold strike, and that it was possible that the next two installments would not live up to the standard it set? Well, I was wrong. Fear Street Part 2, 1978, not only matches 1994 in quality, it manages to surpass it, not only building on the already established canon, but adding to it, giving us stronger characterization and a more in-depth look into the lore. While 1994 came across as a love letter to 90s teen horror in general, 1978 is more an ode to the original series, feeling like a Fear Street book come to life rather than a standard horror flick. And the result is an atmospheric and at times horrific slasher, which stands up as a solo film and as a strong second installment in this trilogy. Those expecting a 70s-esque horror tribute will be surprised, as this film doesn't feel like an homage to the decade, but rather comes across as a film about the 70s told through the lens of the 90s, which actually works perfectly for the overall story, as it ties into the 90s feel of the first film while still setting itself apart from it. Nothing screams the 90s like nostalgia for the 70s, and this film feels like a look back at the decade gone with the rose-tinted glasses of sentimentality. The aesthetics are adjusted from the bright neons of the 90s to the warm yellow, greens and browns of the 70s, and the soundtrack blares with 70s goldies, such as Love Will Keep Us Together, Don't Fear the Reaper, and Carry On My Wayward Son. As with the first film, this one goes hard, and wants you to know exactly which decade it's set in. And, once again, the in-your-face aesthetics and music just add to the overall tone and enjoyment of the movie. The horror references are all there, and we once again get the feel that the filmmakers genuinely love this genre and want to pay homage to it as much as possible. This time, we have shout-outs to the ultimate summer camp slasher series, Friday the 13th, with characters named Alice and Tommy, and the setting itself reminiscent of Camp Crystal Lake. The killer's eventual design is also a shout-out to Jason's original look before he gained his infamous hockey mask. Our final girls in this installment are the Bergman sisters, and their characterization could have come straight from the pages of the original book series, even more so than the first installment, with the sisters being polar opposites and clashing because of this. Cindy is the uptight and prim older sister, with Ziggy being the antagonistic younger sister with an attitude and a huge chip on her shoulder, and the way in which they have to overcome their differences and learn to understand one another is wonderfully reminiscent of many a Fear Street book, in which opposing siblings are brought together through their shared experiences of terror on the titular street. We see the sisters each go through their individual trials at camp. Ziggy is the troublemaker being picked on and bullied by the Sunnyvale kids, a nice bit of continuity from the first film, showing how the rivalry between the Shadysiders and Sunnyvalers stretches back decades, probably even centuries if the hints dropped in this and the previous film are anything to go by. Ziggy carries a huge chip on her shoulder over the curse of being a Shadysider, and her violent and angry attitude is offset by her sister's extreme denial about their circumstances. Cindy's prim and proper exterior masks a fear that she will never escape Shadyside and a desire to flee from her current situation, and her anger at her sister for Ziggy's nihilistic attitude is both realistic and relatable. The two girls make for endearing and likable main characters, so much so that the supporting characters almost fade into the background, the one major exception being Alice, the stoner ex-friend of Cindy's, whose truth bombs and drug-induced sense of adventure give way to a much deeper character with a traumatic past. Alice is an edgier character than would be seen in the original books, which generally steered away from drug use, sex, and underage drinking, but her attitude and tragic backstory could be inspired from many of the troubled kids from the original series. While the first installment of the trilogy felt like a 90s slasher film resurrected from a dead subgenre, this film feels like a Fear Street book come to life on screen. While the original novels initially shied away from more supernatural elements, they did eventually work their way into the series, and with the supernatural came insane instances of gore and violence. Generally speaking, the story of the novels would progress with small scares, atmospheric tension, and the occasional fake-out jump scares, but spread sporadically through this mild creepiness would be dark and horrific acts of brutal violence, which often came out of nowhere with little to no warning. I can still vividly recall reading the Cheerleader trilogy, parts of which inspired this film trilogy, and the horrified reactions I had when a character was suddenly boiled alive in a locker room, Another severed his own hand in woodshop class and bled to death, and one of the books ended with a character forcefully drowning one of her best friends in a bathtub in order to exorcise the spirit possessing them. Let me tell you, the Fear Street I read did not hold back when it came to horror and violence, and this has seeped into the second installment of the film trilogy, heightening the scare factor and making the entire experience that of a novel brought to life. The film moves along with a creepy and unsettling atmosphere, but unlike the first film, which ratcheted up the tension and gore from the get-go, 1978 is a slow burn, following the formula of the books as it introduces the characters, builds the mystery, and slowly reveals the horror. When we do see the violence and gore, the film does not hold back, and the violence is often brutal, at times shocking in its indiscrimination, as we see children as well as teens meet gory deaths at the hands of our terrifying killer. The film recalls Friday the 13th in this respect, and our killer has echoes of Jason Voorhees' silent but unstoppable force. This film also delves much further into the lore, a luxury it has after the first film was forced to focus more on setup and world building, which only allowed for hints of what was to come. 1978 adds a mystery element to the horror, as the teens slowly uncover the story and legend of Sarah Fier, her methods of madness, the terror she still wields, and how exactly they can stop her and her reign of violence. Borrowing aspects from the aforementioned Cheerleader trilogy, in which the character of Sarah Fier was a major player, as well as the Fear Street sagas, which I mentioned in my review of Part 1, this film feels rich in its references to the original series. The book series consisted mostly of standalone novels within a serialized format, and so they didn't lend themselves easily to a film adaptation. This makes the decision to draw plot elements from the sagas fitting, as they provide a more linear storyline with recurring characters, and the way this film expands upon the lore helps to recreate the tone of the books much more so than the first installment, which, while containing hints to the overall story, was more focused on establishing setting, tone, and characterization. 1978 ties nicely into 1994, as the characters from the first film interact with and learn from one of the survivors of the Camp Nightwing massacre, and we get a nice feeling of continuity and follow-through. The twist at the end of 1978, and the way in which it leads into the final installment, promises an intense showdown in the final film, with hints of past lives, characters doomed to repeat the same mistakes, and the origins of the feud between Shadyside and Sunnyvale finally revealed. If 1994 was a brilliant love letter to 90s slashers, then 1978 is a wonderful ode to the original series and builds on the strength of the first installment, amping up the mystery, terror, and thrills. If the final installment does turn out to be a dud, which, after all this, I highly doubt, we can feel satisfied that this trilogy has already offered up 2 installments full of excitement, scares, and intensity, which fans of the original series, as well as newcomers, can enjoy and rewatch for many years.